The call came in just after midnight, breaking the quiet of the small town of Maplewood, Texas. It was Officer Kyle Bennett's first week back on night patrol, and he answered the call for a welfare check with the usual mix of caution and disinterest. A neighbor had reported a strange smell and hadn't seen the resident of 134 West Elm Street in days. By the time Bennett arrived at the house, the stench was overwhelming. The neighborhood was peaceful, with manicured lawns and neatly parked trucks. But the house in question stood out, a neglected property with broken shutters and an overgrown yard. Bennett knocked on the door, his flashlight illuminating the peeling paint. No response. He knocked again, louder this time, calling out, "Maplewood Police! Is anyone home?" The silence was deafening. Then a faint scratching noise came from inside. Bennett's hand instinctively rested on his holster. "Dispatch, this is Officer Bennett. I'm going to check the perimeter." He made his way around the house, flashlight cutting through the darkness. The back door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. Inside, the smell was almost unbearable. Rot and decay clung to the air, making Bennett gag as he stepped into the kitchen. Plates covered in moldy food were stacked on the counter. Flies buzzed around a sink filled with stagnant water. But it was the living room that stopped him in his tracks. A man sat in an old armchair, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His eyes were open but lifeless, staring at the ceiling. Blood stained his clothes, pooling beneath him. Bennett's breath caught in his throat. He reached for his radio but froze as he noticed something more horrifying. On the coffee table in front of the man was a collection of bones, picked clean, arranged meticulously. Some were small enough to be animal bones, but others were unmistakably human. Detective Sarah Langley got the call at 1 a.m. She was Maplewood's seasoned investigator, known for her sharp instincts and unrelenting pursuit of justice. When she arrived at the scene, the house was swarming with officers and forensic technicians. "What do we have?" Langley asked Bennett, who was pale and visibly shaken. "Male victim, mid-40s, cause of death unknown." "But, Detective, it's the table you need to see." Langley stepped inside, her sharp eyes scanning every corner. The scene was worse than she'd imagined. The victim's throat was slit, and his arms were covered in defensive wounds. But the bones, neatly arranged in rows, were the centerpiece of the horror. "Jesus Christ," Langley muttered under her breath. "Is it cannibalism?" Bennett asked hesitantly. Langley didn't answer immediately. She crouched near the table, studying the bones. Some were gnawed on, the bite marks unmistakable. "It's too early to say," she finally replied, though the truth was obvious. The body was identified as Frank Holloway, the homeowner. According to preliminary reports, Frank was a quiet man who kept to himself. Neighbors described him as polite but distant. No one had seen him with visitors in years. "Any signs of forced entry?" Langley asked the forensics lead, Dr. Amanda Reeves. "None," Reeves replied. "Whoever did this either had a key or was invited in." "What about the bones? Are they all human?" Reeves hesitated. "Most of them are, but we found some animal remains mixed in. It's possible he was experimenting or escalating." "Escalating to what?" Langley pressed. Reeves met her eyes, her expression grim. "To murder, and possibly more than one victim." Langley ordered a full search of the property. Officers combed through every inch of the house, the backyard, and the small shed at the edge of the overgrown lawn. What they found in the shed sent another wave of horror through the team. Large freezers lined the walls, and inside were vacuum-sealed bags filled with meat. Some were labeled with names: Alex, Megan, Travis. Langley stared at the evidence, her mind racing. "He was keeping trophies," she said aloud. Back at the precinct, Langley began piecing together what little they knew. Frank Holloway had no criminal record and no history of violence, but the evidence told a different story. A methodical killer who had operated undetected for years. The neighbor who called in the welfare check was interviewed again, this time by Langley herself. "Did you ever see anyone coming or going from Frank's house?" Langley asked. The elderly woman shook her head. "No, ma'am, Frank was a loner. He only left to get groceries, and even then, it was late at night." "Did he ever seem off to you?" The neighbor hesitated. "He was quiet but polite. I never thought he'd be capable of this." Langley spent the rest of the night reviewing Frank's background. He had lived in Maplewood for 15 years, worked as a freelance graphic designer, and had no close family. His only connection to the community was the occasional chat with neighbors or shopkeepers. It wasn't much to go on. The air in the Maplewood Police Department was heavy with tension. Frank Holloway's journals had revealed chilling details about his crimes, but they also posed more questions than answers. Detective Sarah Langley stood in the evidence room, flipping through the pages again, her pen hovering over a notepad filled with scribbled notes. Each journal entry documented a new victim, their name, appearance, how Frank lured them to his house, and, most disturbingly, how he killed them. Travis, young, maybe 21, saw him near the diner off Route 46. Said he needed a ride. Thought he was clever. He wasn't. Took 3 days to finish him. Langley clenched her jaw as she read. There were at least 12 names in the journals, and only some matched the labels found in the freezer. The rest? She could only assume they were long gone, their remains discarded or consumed. The next step was identifying the victims. Langley called a team meeting in the precinct's conference room. Forensics experts, officers, and even the coroner were present, along with stacks of crime scene photos and autopsy reports from Frank's property. Here's what we know, Langley began, pinning photos of the labeled freezer bags to the whiteboard. We've confirmed these names, Alex, Megan, and Travis, through missing persons reports, but there are 9 others mentioned in the journals, and we have no idea who they are. Dr. Amanda Reeves, the forensics lead, spoke up. The bite marks on the bones are consistent with human teeth. Frank didn't just kill these people, he consumed parts of them. The room fell silent. Even the seasoned officers were struggling to stomach the reality of the case. Langley assigned her team to cross-reference the journals with missing persons reports from the last 5 years. Meanwhile, she focused on the most recent victim, Alex, whose name appeared on a bag in the freezer. Alex Carter had disappeared 3 weeks earlier, according to his family. He was a 27-year-old mechanic who worked at a local garage. His girlfriend had reported him missing after he failed to return home from a night out. Langley visited Alex's family, hoping to find any connection between him and Frank Holloway. His girlfriend Emily answered the door, her eyes red and swollen from weeks of crying. "Detective Langley, right?" Emily said, her voice trembling. "Did you find him?" Langley hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "We're still investigating, but we believe Alex may have been in contact with Frank Holloway before his disappearance. Do you know if Alex had any connection to him?" Emily frowned, shaking her head. "No, I've never heard that name. Alex didn't talk about new friends or anything like that." "Did he mention meeting anyone unusual in the weeks before he disappeared?" Langley pressed. Emily thought for a moment. "He mentioned a guy at the diner, an older man. He said the guy kept staring at him, but Alex just thought he was weird." Langley's pen froze on her notepad. "Which diner?" "Tommy's, off Route 46. Tommy's Diner was a greasy spoon, popular with truckers and locals alike." Langley walked in with a photo of Frank Holloway and approached the manager. "Do you recognize this man?" she asked, showing the photo. The manager squinted at it. "Yeah, that's Frank. He came in here all the time. Quiet guy, kept to himself. Why? Did you ever see him talking to this man?" Langley held up a picture of Alex Carter. The manager nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I did. Couple weeks ago. Alex was sitting at the counter, and Frank sat next to him. They talked for a bit, but I didn't think much of it. Frank left first." "Did they leave together?" "No, but Alex left not long after. Maybe a few minutes." Langley returned to the precinct, piecing together the timeline. Frank had likely targeted Alex at the diner, striking up a casual conversation to gain his trust. The journals revealed a pattern. Frank preyed on the kind and trusting, people who wouldn't suspect danger until it was too late. Langley's team uncovered more connections between the victims and Frank. Megan, a college student, had been lured in after accepting a ride home. Travis, the hitchhiker, had been picked up along Route 46. Each victim was vulnerable, isolated, and easy to manipulate. But the investigation hit a wall with the unidentified victims. Some of the names in Frank's journals were first names only: Julie, Michael, Ben, and there were no corresponding missing persons reports. Langley began to suspect that Frank's reach extended beyond Maplewood. She called the Texas Department of Public Safety for assistance, requesting access to statewide missing persons databases. This guy wasn't just a small-town predator, Langley told her lieutenant. He traveled and he brought his victims back here. We're dealing with a serial killer. Days later, Langley's theory was confirmed. Detective Sarah Langley sat at her desk, the words "The Watcher" scrawled across the top of her notepad. Frank Holloway's journals painted a vivid picture of his heinous crimes, but the mention of this mysterious accomplice added a chilling new layer to the case. Was the Watcher real, or was this another delusion from a deranged mind? Her instincts told her there was truth in Frank's words. After all, every journal entry so far had matched real victims. Langley had no reason to believe the Watcher was a figment of his imagination. The first step was identifying any leads. Langley revisited Frank's house, combing through the cluttered rooms and hidden basement with a fine-tooth comb. Forensics had already collected the major evidence, but she was searching for something smaller, something overlooked. In the corner of the basement, near the chest freezer, Langley noticed a loose floorboard. Kneeling down, she pried it up with her pocket knife and discovered a small notebook, its cover stained with grease. Flipping through its pages, Langley's breath caught. The handwriting was different from Frank's, more precise with deliberate strokes. The entries were brief, almost clinical, and described Frank's actions from an outsider's perspective. Tuesday. Frank brought a young man home. Didn't resist much. Observed from the window. He's getting sloppy. Friday. Cleaned up after him. Left the freezer running. Frank can't manage without me. Langley's stomach churned. The entries were dated over the last 2 years, and they confirmed her fears. The Watcher was very real and had been aiding Frank in his crimes. Back at the precinct, Langley called a meeting with her team. She placed the newly discovered notebook on the table. "This changes everything," she began, her tone grave. Frank Holloway wasn't working alone. Someone else was helping him, watching, documenting, even cleaning up after him. The team murmured in disbelief. Officer Jacob Price, a young detective, leaned forward. "Do we have any idea who this Watcher might be?" Langley shook her head. "Not yet, but the handwriting in this notebook doesn't match Frank's. Forensics is running tests on the notebook now. We're also checking fingerprints, but this person was careful. They knew how to cover their tracks." Langley dug deeper into Frank's life, hoping to uncover a connection to the Watcher. She interviewed Frank's neighbors, co-workers, and anyone who had interacted with him regularly. Most described him as a loner, but a few recalled seeing a shadowy figure lurking around his property. "There was a man," said Mrs. Cartwright, an elderly neighbor. "Didn't see him much, but he'd come by at odd hours. Always parked down the street and walked up to the house." "Can you describe him?" Langley asked, her notepad ready. "Tall, skinny, wore a hood most of the time. Never saw his face, but he moved. Strange, like he didn't want to be noticed." The forensic analysis of the notebook yielded partial fingerprints, but they didn't match anyone in the database. However, the paper used in the notebook was traced to a specific store, a small stationery shop in downtown Dallas. Langley visited the store, hoping for a lead. The shop owner, a middle-aged man with a sharp memory, remembered selling that particular notebook. "Yeah, I sold a few of those last year," he said. "Rare model. Only a couple of customers bought them." Langley showed him a photo of Frank. "Was he one of them?" The shop owner frowned. "No, don't think so. But there was another guy, kind of creepy. Always wore a hoodie, didn't say much. Paid in cash. Do you have security cameras?" "Sure do. Let me pull up the footage." The footage from the shop was grainy but clear enough to make out a man in a dark hoodie purchasing the notebook. His face was partially obscured, but Langley noted his approximate height and build. She requested the footage for further analysis and returned to the precinct. She sent the video to the tech team, who enhanced the footage to reveal more details about the man's appearance. His face was still mostly hidden, but a distinctive tattoo peeked out from under his sleeve. A black serpent coiled around his wrist. Langley now had a critical piece of evidence. Tattoos were unique, and this one might lead her to the Watcher. The investigation took a dark turn when Langley received a call from the coroner. They had found a new set of remains in Frank's backyard, a shallow grave containing the bones of a woman in her early 30s. She wasn't in the journals, the coroner explained. We think she might have been an early victim. Langley examined the remains, noting a deep slash across the ribs. The coroner pointed to the marks. These cuts are different from Frank's usual method. Cleaner, more precise. Langley's heart sank. You're saying this wasn't Frank? The coroner nodded. It's possible the Watcher did this one. Langley's suspicions about the Watcher grew. Liam Ryder sat in the cold interrogation room, his smirk fading as Detective Langley pushed forward. His silence had worked for hours, but Langley was patient, methodical, and relentless. She knew the Watcher wouldn't crack easily, but she also knew he had underestimated her. Langley began the interrogation with subtlety. Liam, you might think you're clever, but Frank Holloway's dead. There's no loyalty left to protect. You're carrying this weight alone now. Ryder leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You've got nothing on me, he finally muttered. Langley placed the notebook in front of him. Your words, your handwriting. We matched your fingerprints to the pages. You think that's nothing? Ryder glanced at the notebook but said nothing. Here's what I think, Langley continued. You liked the thrill of it, watching Frank, guiding him. But it wasn't enough, was it? That's why there's a victim buried in his backyard with clean cuts. Your handiwork. For the first time, Ryder's jaw tightened. Langley saw the flicker of fear in his eyes, and she pressed harder. Over the next few days, Langley and her team built a solid case. They uncovered more evidence tying Ryder to Frank's crimes. Receipts from local hardware stores matching tools found at the crime scenes, surveillance footage placing Ryder near Frank's house, and DNA traces linking him to the freezer in the basement. Despite the mountain of evidence, Ryder refused to confess. Langley knew he was stalling, waiting for his lawyer, but she also sensed he was hiding something deeper. Langley's breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Frank Holloway's journals. As she combed through them again, she noticed several cryptic symbols scribbled in the margins. At first, they seemed like random doodles, but a closer inspection revealed a pattern. She brought the symbols to her tech team, who ran them through a database. The results were startling. The symbols were linked to an underground network of online forums frequented by individuals with violent tendencies. One forum in particular stood out. It was a dark website where users shared twisted fantasies, crime techniques, and even real-life experiences. Langley felt a chill as she realized Frank and Ryder might not have acted alone. They could have been part of something much larger. Langley obtained a warrant to search Ryder's apartment, hoping to find more evidence of his connection to the dark web. What they found was far worse than she imagined. The small apartment was sparsely furnished, but the walls were lined with maps, photographs, and handwritten notes. It was a disturbing shrine to his crimes. Pinned to one wall was a detailed timeline of Frank Holloway's murders, complete with victim photos and locations. Another wall featured surveillance photos of potential new targets, men, women, and even children. In Ryder's bedroom, Langley found a laptop hidden beneath the mattress. It was encrypted, but the tech team cracked it within hours. The files on the laptop confirmed Ryder's involvement in Frank's crimes and revealed his connection to the Watcher Network, a secret group of individuals who encouraged and celebrated acts of violence. The laptop contained hundreds of chat logs between Ryder and other members of the network. Some messages were chillingly casual. Great work with the last one. Clean cuts. Very professional. Frank's getting sloppy. You should handle the next one yourself. Others were more sinister. Let's escalate. Bigger targets. More attention. This isn't just about killing. It's about sending a message. Langley's stomach turned as she read the messages. Ryder wasn't just an accomplice. He was a leader, orchestrating Frank's murders and grooming others to commit their own. Langley confronted Ryder with the evidence, placing printouts of the chat logs in front of him. His smirk returned, but it was tinged with arrogance. You think you've uncovered something big, he said, but you don't know the half of it. Langley leaned in, her voice cold. Enlighten me. Ryder chuckled. You think this ends with me? With Frank? We're just pawns in a much bigger game. Langley's heart raced. Who's pulling the strings? Ryder didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. The case took a national turn as Langley's team uncovered more members of the Watcher network. The FBI was brought in, launching a massive operation to track down and dismantle the group. Langley stayed focused on Ryder, determined to get a full confession. She spent hours poring over his chat logs, searching for clues about the group's hierarchy. One username appeared repeatedly in the logs: the Shepherd. Unlike the other members, the Shepherd seemed to issue orders rather than participate in the discussions. Ryder referred to him with respect and fear, suggesting he was the true leader of the Watcher network. Langley's next move was clear. She needed to find the Shepherd. Detective Langley left the interrogation room with a storm brewing inside her. Liam Ryder's cryptic words, "The Shepherd isn't a man, it's an idea," echoed in her mind. She had dealt with psychopaths and criminals before, but this case was spinning into uncharted territory. The Watcher network wasn't just a group of deranged individuals. It was something darker, more elusive. The FBI's cybercrime unit took the lead in tracing the Shepherd's digital footprint, using every tool at their disposal to dig into the hidden network. While Langley waited for updates, she and her team revisited every piece of evidence in their possession, hoping to uncover something they might have missed. Frank Holloway's journals provided a breakthrough. In one of the earlier entries, Frank had described meeting someone at a remote location just outside of town, a mentor who had opened his eyes and shown him the path. The description of the location was vague, but Langley recognized a pattern in his words. He referred to the place as the Sanctuary, and the phrase came up multiple times in his writings. Langley instructed her team to search for properties or abandoned buildings near the area Frank had described. Within hours, they pinpointed an old dilapidated church on the outskirts of town, hidden deep in a wooded area. It had been abandoned for over a decade. Langley and a tactical team approached the church under the cover of night. The building loomed like a ghost, its windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. Inside, they found a disturbing scene. Candles had burned down to their stubs on an altar adorned with strange symbols, identical to the ones Frank had scribbled in his journals. Around the room were photographs of various people, some crossed out in red ink. Langley's heart sank as she realized these were likely victims, past and future. In one corner of the room, they found a collection of videotapes and a dusty laptop. The tapes were labeled with dates, and the laptop was locked with an intricate encryption system. Langley took everything back to the station, knowing these items could hold the answers she needed. The next morning, the FBI's cyber team cracked the laptop. What they found was horrifying. Hours of video footage showing Frank Holloway torturing and killing his victims, guided by a distorted voice coming from a speaker in the background. The voice was calm, almost soothing, as it directed Frank. Slower this time. Look into their eyes. Feel the power, the connection. Langley clenched her fists as she watched the footage. This wasn't just murder. It was indoctrination. Frank had been groomed, manipulated into becoming the monster he was. The tapes, meanwhile, revealed a sickening pattern. Each video ended with Frank kneeling in front of the camera, addressing the Shepherd directly. "I've done what you asked," he would say. "Am I ready now?" The final tape, dated just weeks before Frank's arrest, showed something different. In it, Frank was visibly distraught, pacing back and forth. "I can't do this anymore," he muttered. "I'm done." The distorted voice responded, colder this time. "There's no leaving, Frank. You're part of something eternal." Langley paused the tape, her mind racing. The Shepherd wasn't just a shadowy figure. It was a puppeteer, pulling strings from behind the scenes. The investigation took a darker turn when the FBI uncovered encrypted chat logs on the laptop. The messages were between Frank, Ryder, and several other members of the Watcher network. Among the chatter about potential targets and methods, one username stood out: Eternal Guide. Langley recognized the username instantly. It matched the patterns she had seen in the forums, the Shepherd's alias. The messages from Eternal Guide were chillingly direct. The sanctuary must remain untouched. Ensure loyalty. Punish betrayal. Prepare for the ascension. Langley's instincts told her that the Shepherd, or Eternal Guide, was more than just an online persona. Someone was behind the screen, orchestrating everything. The FBI traced Eternal Guide's digital presence to a server in a remote part of Texas. The server was located on private property owned by a shell company, making it difficult to determine who was behind it. Langley and a small team flew to the location, hoping to find answers. The property was heavily fortified, with high fences and security cameras. As the team breached the perimeter, they found the server housed in an underground bunker. The air was thick with dust, and the hum of machinery filled the space. Inside the bunker, they found racks of servers, monitors displaying live feeds from various locations, and a single chair in front of the main terminal. The screens showed chilling footage, live surveillance of unsuspecting people, their daily routines captured without their knowledge. Langley felt a wave of nausea as she realized the scope of the Watcher network. The FBI headquarters buzzed with activity as agents dissected the seized servers. Detective Langley sat in the dimly lit operations room, staring at the flickering monitors displaying fragments of the network. With every recovered file, every decrypted chat, they got closer to understanding the depths of the Shepherd's organization. Yet one crucial question remained unanswered. Who was the Shepherd? Langley's attention was drawn to a folder labeled Ascension. It contained a series of coded messages, each referencing an event tied to the Watcher network. One message stood out. Prepare the vessel for the gathering. February 14th, midnight. The Sanctuary. It was a date less than 72 hours away. Langley's gut tightened. The Sanctuary, as referenced in Frank Holloway's journals and now this file, seemed to be the heart of the operation. The gathering was likely a pivotal event, a ritual tied to the Shepherd's twisted ideology. Langley called for an emergency briefing with her team and the FBI. The plan was clear. They would raid the Sanctuary during the gathering, aiming to dismantle the network's leadership. The Sanctuary was located deep in the wilderness, miles from the nearest town. Satellite images showed a sprawling compound surrounded by thick forests with no discernible access points. It had been deliberately hidden, shielded from prying eyes. On the night of February 14th, Langley and a tactical team moved into position. The forest was eerily silent, the moonlight barely piercing through the dense canopy. As they approached the compound, they spotted movement. Figures cloaked in black robes, carrying torches, their faces obscured by masks. Langley signaled for the team to hold their positions. Through binoculars, she observed a chilling sight. Dozens of people gathered in a circle around a central figure. The man stood tall, his face hidden by a mask shaped like a goat's skull. "The Shepherd," Langley whispered. The team advanced cautiously, using the shadows to their advantage. As they moved closer, they could hear the Shepherd speaking. His voice was deep, commanding, and strangely hypnotic. "This night marks the beginning of the ascension," he proclaimed. "We are not bound by laws or morality. We are free, and tonight we prove our devotion." Langley's blood ran cold as she noticed an altar at the center of the circle. A young woman, bound and gagged, lay atop it. The Shepherd raised a blade high into the air, the crowd chanting in unison. "Move in!" Langley ordered. The tactical team stormed the compound, flash bangs lighting up the night as agents shouted commands. The crowd scattered in chaos, some fleeing into the woods while others fought back. Langley focused on the Shepherd, who had dropped the blade and was retreating toward a hidden passage. "Stop!" she yelled, chasing after him. The Shepherd disappeared into the passage, and Langley followed, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The narrow tunnel led to a hidden bunker, its walls lined with symbols matching those in Frank Holloway's journals. In the center of the room stood the Shepherd, his mask discarded to reveal a face that sent shockwaves through Langley. It was Dr. Martin Winslow, a respected psychologist who had consulted on criminal cases, including some of Langley's own investigations. Langley raised her gun, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions. "It's over, Martin. We know everything." Winslow smirked, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Do you, Detective? You think stopping me will end this? The Shepherd isn't a person. It's an idea. You can't kill an idea. An idea doesn't torture and kill innocent people," Langley shot back. Winslow's expression darkened. "Innocent?" They were weak. "Society breeds weakness, and I showed them how to rise above it. You'll never understand." Langley approached cautiously, handcuffing him as he continued to rant about his philosophy. "You think you've won," he hissed, "but the ascension will continue, with or without me." Back at the station, the interrogation began. Winslow was unrepentant, refusing to reveal the full extent of the network. However, the evidence recovered from the sanctuary was damning. Dozens of laptops and encrypted drives contained lists of members, financial records, and more gruesome footage. The FBI worked tirelessly to identify and apprehend members of the Watcher network. Meanwhile, Langley reflected on the twisted mind of Martin Winslow. How had a respected psychologist become the leader of such a horrific cult? The answer lay in Winslow's early career. Digging into his past, Langley discovered a history of unethical experiments and a fascination with manipulating human behavior. His psychological expertise had allowed him to prey on vulnerable individuals, shaping them into killers like Frank Holloway. The shepherd was gone, but Langley knew the fight wasn't over. The Watcher network was vast, and its members were still out there. The arrest of Dr. Martin Winslow, the shepherd, sent shockwaves through the nation. The respected psychologist turned cult leader became the face of one of the most horrifying criminal networks ever uncovered. News outlets buzzed with headlines about the Watcher network, its cannibalistic rituals, and the twisted philosophy that drove its members to kill. But for Detective Langley, the work was far from over. The evidence recovered from the sanctuary provided a roadmap to dismantling the network. Langley and the FBI identified hundreds of members, ranging from isolated individuals to influential figures in politics, business, and law enforcement. Each arrest unearthed more information, pulling the threads of a vast, intricate web. Interviews with captured members revealed the depth of Winslow's influence. He had used his expertise in psychology to identify and exploit his followers' vulnerabilities, promising them power, freedom, or redemption. Many described him as charismatic and almost godlike, capable of convincing them to commit unthinkable acts. Langley studied their confessions with a mix of disgust and fascination. Winslow's ability to manipulate others was unparalleled, but it was clear he thrived on control and chaos. During the months that followed, Langley worked tirelessly to connect the dots. She spent hours poring over files, watching footage, and conducting interviews. The Watcher network wasn't just a cult, it was a well-oiled machine. The financial records revealed millions of dollars funneled through offshore accounts to fund the network. Members contributed money, property, and resources, believing they were part of a higher purpose. Winslow had used this wealth to build the sanctuary, buy surveillance equipment, and bribe officials who turned a blind eye to his activities. One discovery chilled Langley to the core: a ledger detailing recruitment efforts. Winslow had targeted troubled teens, the mentally ill, and individuals with criminal histories. He called them vessels, believing they could be molded into killers. Frank Holloway had been one such vessel. Dr. Martin Winslow's trial became a media circus. Prosecutors painted him as a master manipulator who used his expertise to prey on the vulnerable. The evidence against him was overwhelming, from the encrypted messages to the videos of him directing murders. Winslow, ever the showman, refused to admit guilt. He delivered long, rambling statements in court, spouting his philosophy of ascension and accusing society of suppressing human potential. His words, however, failed to sway the jury. After weeks of testimony, Winslow was found guilty on all charges, including multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and human trafficking. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Langley watched from the back of the courtroom as the verdict was read. Justice had been served, but she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Winslow's influence would linger. As Langley continued to track down members of the Watcher network, she noticed a troubling trend. Despite Winslow's arrest, the ideology of the shepherd persisted. Online forums buzzed with activity, and new leaders emerged, determined to carry on his work. One night, while reviewing a new case tied to the network, Langley received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "The shepherd lives." The email contained a single sentence: "Ideas don't die." Langley stared at the screen, her mind racing. Was this a bluff? A scare tactic? Or was someone truly attempting to resurrect Winslow's twisted movement? Despite the lingering darkness, Langley found solace in the resilience of the victims' families. Many had come forward to share their stories, determined to honor the memories of their loved ones. Some even created foundations to help others avoid falling prey to similar manipulations. Langley also took comfort in her team's relentless dedication. Together, they had brought down a monster and saved countless lives. While the fight was far from over, they had proven that even the most shadowy networks could be exposed to the light. Months after Winslow's trial, Langley visited the gravesite of Frank Holloway's victims. She laid flowers at each headstone, reflecting on the lives lost in the evil that had taken them. As she stood in silence, Langley made a promise to continue the fight no matter how long it took. The Shepherd's network had been dealt a critical blow, but its remnants would always pose a threat. For Langley, the case had changed her forever. She had seen the depths of human depravity, but she had also witnessed the power of justice, courage, and determination. Walking back to her car, she looked up at the night sky. The stars above shone brightly, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always light.